Howdy, welcome to the final chapter, chapter 15, the special senses. So there's 3 videos on the eye, and then there'll be 1 video on smell and taste, and then I think there'll be 3 videos on hearing, then we'll be done. So obviously it's a cartoon of the eye. This is a cartoon of olfaction, our sense of smell. Here's your tongue. Tongue doesn't exactly look like that, but those are taste buds on your tongue. And then there's your ear. And then this gal spinning around, that's for equilibrium. So that equilibrium apparatus lives in the same zip code as your ear does. Okay, so this is a cartoon of an eyeball, and it shows this yellow stuff that's peeled back here. This is all your retina, and that's where the photoreceptors that detect light send information through the optic nerve, and then through a series of projections and synapses, the information about what you've seen goes back here to the visual cortex. Remember that from the brain? 70% of all the sensory receptors that are in your body are in the eye, and they live in the retina, and there's a special type of sensory receptor called a photoreceptor. And almost half of the entire cerebral cortex is involved in processing visual information. So sight is important to us primates. So here's a photograph of an eye. It just shows a lot of stuff that you guys already know. The eyebrow is up here, and its function is to shade the eye. This piece here, this is your upper eyelid. And then of course, if you have a upper eyelid, you have a lower eyelid down here. The eyelashes, they have sensory neurons in the follicle of your eyelash that can initiate a blinking reflex. Between the 2 eyelids is this fissure or opening space called the palpebral fissure. So anything that has palpebral or palpebrae in it, that has to do with your eyelids. And then I don't know if you remember, in the spinal cord you had a commissure, a gray commissure. Well, that's an area. So this is the lateral commissure. That's where your 2 eyelids come together. So if there's a lateral commissure, there's a medial commissure, and what lives in the medial commissure is this thing called a lacrimal caruncle, and that contains oil and sweat glands. This piece here, this is your iris, and then the opening is the pupil, and then the white here, this is the sclera of your eye, and it's covered by a conjunctiva. So here's the cartoon of the eye, things that let's see, I think there's only one thing on this cartoon that was on the last cartoon, and that's this palpebral fissure. And remember, that's this space between the upper eyelid. So here's the upper eyelid, here's the lower eyelid, and that space is the palpebral fissure. We looked at some of these muscles, eye muscles, when we were talking about the optic nerve, the cranial nerve. So this muscle that can give mobility to your upper eyelid is called the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. So here it is. And then there's this muscle here, orbicularis oculi muscle. So that you can see that's also associated with your eyebrow and then runs into your eyelid. And then to give your eyelid shape is this thing called a tarsal plate. So here's the tarsal plate for your upper eyelid. Here's the tarsal plate for your lower eyelid that gives your eyelid shape. And then within the tarsal plate, there's things called tarsal glands or meibomian glands. The cornea, so here's the cornea that covers the iris and the pupil. And then this conjunctiva There's palpebral conjunctiva and bulbar conjunctiva. So any of the conjunctiva associated with the eyelids, so all this here, this would be covered with palpebral conjunctiva. And then when you turn here and you come back and now your conjunctiva on the eye, that's called bulbar conjunctiva. And then I just give some functions here. Orbicularis oculi muscle closes the eyelids. We talked about the tarsal plate giving shape or support to your eyelids. The cornea is just the anterior continuation of the sclera. So this part that's all cut here, that's all sclera, and the anterior continuation here is the cornea. And it's made of cuboidal, stratified cuboidal epithelium, and it's kind of a window over your iris and pupil. So this is all iris, and then we talked about that opening is the pupil. But the cornea is not covered by the conjunctiva. Conjunctiva is just a transparent mucous membrane. Like I said, it doesn't cover the cornea. It just covers the conjunctiva, just covers the white of your eye, the white sclera. And if you get an infection of the conjunctiva, that's conjunctivitis, or sometimes called pink eye. Okay. So the conjunctiva, talk a little bit more about the conjunctiva. It's a transparent mucous membrane. There's palpebral conjunctiva, we talked about that lines the eyelids. So this is all palpebral conjunctiva. But then when that palpebral conjunctiva turns back and starts covering the eye, that's the bulbar conjunctiva. And conjunctiva provides or produces a lubricating mucus secretion that helps your eye from drying out. We talked about how conjunctivitis is an infection. Have you heard of a stye? So here's a photograph of someone with a stye, or it's also called a hordeolum. It sounds like Latin to me. But it's an infection of the sebaceous glands that lubricate the eye, and it's also associated with hair follicles. This is a chalazion, and it's an infection of the tarsal glands. The tarsal glands they're modified sebaceous glands, so it gives kind of an oily secretion that prevents the eyelids from sticking to the eye. And then there's a structure, it's called the lacrimal apparatus, and that brings tears to your eyes. So it's kind of an interesting setup, how it all flows medially, so the tears flow medially, and then they flow down into your nose. And if anyone's ever cried, they know that you can get a stuffy nose full of fluid. So this guy right here is the lacrimal gland. And what happens is when the lacrimal gland secretes its fluid, it travels through these excretory ducts. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, looks like 6 excretory ducts of the lacrimal gland. And then the lacrimate, I don't know if it's called lacrimate, I just made it up, but the fluid, the tears, flow down and across your eye until they get to this area called the lacrimal punctum. And then there's a little that's an opening here. This little lacrimal punctum is an opening, and then the tears can flow through that opening into this lacrimal canaliculus. So remember where we heard canaliculus in the skeletal system? So the tears flow the lacrimal canaliculus, and then they flow into this thing called a nasolacrimal duct, into the inferior meatus of your nasal cavity, which you'll learn all about in 202. And then the tears can flow out your nostrils. So that's the lacrimal apparatus. So tears actually are a dilute saline solution, and tears contain mucus, antibodies, lysozyme. Lysozyme is an enzyme that can kill bacteria. When you blink, that helps spread the tears across the surface of the eye. and then we talked about the flow of the tears. Okay, so these are the extrinsic eye muscles of the eye. So it gives you the muscle here, the lateral rectus. Its action, it moves the eye laterally, and the cranial nerve that controls it is cranial nerve 6, or the abducens. So rectus means straight, and oblique means at an angle. So this would be, let's see, this looks like it's the right eye, so this would be the lateral rectus, and then in here would be the medial rectus, and then here would be the inferior rectus, and let's see, these guys running at an angle would be the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. And then it tells you, if you think about what happens when the muscle gets shorter, so for example, if we take the lateral rectus, what's going to happen when this muscle gets shorter? So imagine this muscle getting shorter, it's going to pull on this tendon, and then that's going to move your eyeball laterally. So if this is the right eyeball. So all 6 extrinsic eye muscles originate from the bony orbit. So here's the bone, and they insert, here's the bony orbit, and then they insert on the sclera, the fibrous sclera, or the whites of your eyes, the sclera. Okay. So this just gives you a cartoon. We talked about these. This just labels the muscles for you. These muscles collectively enable your eye to follow a moving object. And then the muscles, along with other things, help maintain the shape of your eyeball. So there's 4 rectus muscles. So there is the lateral and medial rectus and the superior and inferior rectus. And the names indicate the movement that they promote. And then there's the 2 oblique muscles that help rotate your eyeball. So this is a superior view of your right eye. So it's like probably a transverse section just over your eyeball. And then you're looking on top. And here's all the muscles. Here's something we haven't talked about, this thing called the trochlea. But we have heard of the trochlear nerve, right? So the trochlear nerve innervates this superior oblique muscle. And I think trochlea in Latin means pulley, because the superior oblique muscle, the tendon, runs through this thing called a trochlea and then inserts on the cornea. Or sorry, yeah. Okay. I can't, okay, this won't go back, the PowerPoint won't go back, but I meant that the muscles of the eye insert on the sclera, so the white of your eye. Muscles insert on the sclera. So structure of the eyeball. The wall of the eyeball contains 3 layers. Sometimes they call them tunics. There's this fibrous sclera. So all this white in the cartoon, this is all fibrous sclera. And then remember right here, the fibrous sclera ends, and then the cornea begins. And then the cornea will run from here to here. So they're all where the cornea begins and ends, that's all fibrous sclera. And then deep to the fibrous sclera is this vascular choroid, so that's where all the blood vessels are. And then deep to the choroid is the retina, where the photoreceptors are. Okay. So we said here's the sclera. Its anterior continuation is the cornea. The iris is this structure here. So this is the iris that's cut. And then here's the pupil, or the opening of the iris. And then just posterior to the opening of the pupil, you have the lens of the eye. So what's the correct order of light transmission from the air to the retina? So if you're out here, let's say you start here, you're a molecule in the air, or let's say you're a photon of light. What you do is the first thing as you're trying to get to the retina to tell those photoreceptors that there's something out here to see. So the light waves full of photons travel. The first thing they'll run into is the cornea. And then just in this cartoon, they'll go through the pupil and then they'll run it to the lens. And then they'll move through this humor and they'll finally get back here to the retina. And then the eye has a pole, like the north and south pole. So there's an anterior pole and a posterior pole. And then there's some other structures. So this is the ciliary. Well, actually, this is the iris. We talked about this being the iris. This is the ciliary body attached to the rear of the iris. And then you have this ora serrata, which is just the serrated edge of the ciliary body. The ciliary zonula, so it's these ligaments, suspensory ligaments attached to the lens. What else? Oh, and then this opening here, this is an opening, a sinus, and it's a scleral venous sinus, and we'll talk about that, how you make fluid in your eye and then how that fluid moves around. This posterior segment of the eyeball contains a fluid called the vitreous humor. Also over here there's a spot called the macula lutea, so it's like the yellow spot, and within the macula lutea is this structure called the fovea centralis. That's what your lens works hard to focus all the light waves coming in to this area, the macula lutea and the fovea centralis. And then here's the optic nerve. So this is a photograph of a human eye that shows you all the structures that we just talked about. So let's go over each layer or tunic individually. So the first one we'll go over is the sclera. So remember, that's all this white part out here. And the anterior continuation of the sclera is the cornea. The sclera, like I said earlier, is the white of your eye. It's the outermost layer of the eyeball, and it's a dense avascular connective tissue. So that means that within the sclera there are no blood vessels. However, there's cells that live in there and they need oxygen and glucose, and the sclera is right next to this piece that we'll talk about in a minute called the choroid, and that has a lot of blood vessels, and oxygen and glucose can diffuse to the cells in the sclera. Sclera protects the eyeball, shapes the eyeball, and it also anchors those 6 extrinsic eye muscles. The cornea is the transparent anterior region of the sclera. When light rays come into the cornea, it depends on what angle they're coming in. The cornea will refract or bend the light when it enters the eye. There's pain receptors there that will contribute to your blinking and tearing reflexes. And if it gets damaged, it has a high capacity for regeneration. Phew, I'm glad that happens. The second layer, or the layer deep to the sclera, is the vascular layer or the choroid. So that's this kind of, what is that? It's like a brick red. Anyway, that's all choroid. Supplies blood to all layers of the eyeball. So this is highly vascular, excuse me, and so oxygen and glucose can diffuse to both the cells that live in the sclera. So you get diffusion from the choroid to the sclera, and you also get diffusion of oxygen and glucose to the cells of the retina. There's a brown pigment that lives in the choroid that absorbs light, so that light isn't scattering all over in your eyeball. It's directed to where it's supposed to go. Fovea centralis and the macula lutea. So then there's the ciliary body of the choroid, and we talked about this earlier, but this is this piece right here. This is all ciliary body of the choroid, and it surrounds the lens. And within the ciliary body, there's ciliary muscles, and the ciliary muscles, when they contract and relax, will pull on these suspensory ligaments and will make the lens flatter or more globular. And if you remember from autonomic nervous system, a flat lens will allow you to see further distance, so that would be sympathetic nervous system, and a more globular lens allows you to see allows you to see not long distance, so that's parasympathetic rest and digest. Okay, now another part of the choroid, besides the ciliary body, is the iris. So remember that all this brown stuff, this is all choroid. Come down here, this is the ciliary body of the choroid, and then this would be the iris of the choroid. It's the colored part of the eye. It's made of smooth muscle. It surrounds your pupil, and the iris regulates the amount of light that comes into your eyeball by making the pupil diameter bigger or smaller. And we saw this when we talked about the cranial nerves, but under parasympathetic stimulation, the sphincter pupillae will contract, of the iris will contract, and you'll decrease pupil size. And in sympathetic nervous system situation, this muscle out here, the dilator pupillae contraction, will increase the pupil size. So there's two modified smooth muscle cells of the iris, or two muscles, the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae. And those muscles are not skeletal muscle, they're not cardiac muscle, they're smooth muscle. And we said this, the iris regulates the amount of light passing to the visual receptors or the photoreceptors in your retina. With close vision and bright light, the pupils will constrict. That's sympathetic nervous system. So the sphincter pupillae will contract. Distant vision and dim light, the pupils dilate or get bigger, and that's under control of the dilator pupillae muscle. Also, this is kind of interesting. The diameter of your pupils will change according to your emotional state. So the pupils will get bigger, diameter will get wider. They'll dilate when the subject matter is appealing. So that says to me, if there's someone that you like looking at, then your pupils will dilate. Okay, then the deepest layer of the eye is the retina. So let's take a look on our cartoon here. So here, light's coming in. It's going to hit the cornea first, and then it'll go through the pupil and the lens, and it'll find its way back here to the retina. And then you bring the cartoon out and make it bigger, and you can see this piece right here is the neural layer of the retina. So all this is the neural layer of the retina. And then this little piece out here, that's kind of orange piece, this is the pigmented layer of the retina. And then here's the sclera, the white, and then just superficial to the pigmented layer of the retina is the choroid. So retina is a delicate two-layered membrane. The outer pigmented layer, so this piece right here, the outer pigmented layer, just deep to the choroid layer, absorbs light and helps prevent light from scattering so that the light waves aren't sending missed cues to your photoreceptors. The retina is a neural layer. It's not, doesn't have any blood vessels in it. It's not connective tissue. It's neurons. The neurons specifically have a name in the retina. They're called rod and cone photoreceptors, and that means they transduce light energy. So we talked a little bit about what it means to transduce energy, or transduce a stimulus. So the stimulus is light, and these cells will transduce that light energy into electrical energy, and the action potential will travel back to the brain, and woohoo, you get to see stuff. It consists of not only rod and cone photoreceptors, but also these cells called bipolar cells that will connect the photoreceptors to the ganglion cells. And it's the ganglion cells' axons that will form the optic nerve. And action potentials will travel through the axons of the ganglion cells in the optic nerve. And then there's also this space right here called the optic disc, or the blind spot. And as you can see, there's no photoreceptors there. That's the site where the optic nerve leaves the eye. So this, hopefully you know that yellow is usually nervous tissue. So this is the optic nerve. So it's full of axons of ganglion cells leaving the eye, and there's a space right here called the blind spot. There's no photoreceptors in there. Okay, so here's a cartoon of the retina and the photoreceptors. So again, let's go up to our cartoon up top. Here's the light, comes in, travels all the way back to the back of the eyeball, and then all the way to the back of the retina before those light waves or light rays with their photons are a stimulus for these cells, the rods and cones. So these purple guys are the rods, and these yellow guys are cones. Rods are for dim light. Rods will allow you to see things in shades of gray. Cones allow you to see things in color. And so this is kind of interesting. This is the pathway of light. So light has to get through all these, light has to get through all these axons of ganglion cells right here. Has to pass through all these different cell types before that light can get to the rods and cones. And then the signal output is going this way. So let's say some light waves strike this rod cell. It's going to send a message back this way. And then that action potential will travel in the axon of the ganglion cells through the optic nerve. And I told you this rods, the main function is to operate in dim light. Rods are more numerous at the periphery or the peripheral regions of the retina. And then cones will operate in bright light. They provide high acuity color vision, so sharpness of vision, border detection in vision, and they're found in the macula lutea of the retina. But within the macula lutea, cones are most concentrated in a place called the fovea centralis. So here's the names of the other cells that participate in the retina. There's bipolar cells, there's this amacrine cell, there's a horizontal cell, and then there's the ganglion cells. And mostly what we're going to talk about when we talk about signal transduction or stimulus transduction, we'll talk about the rods and cones here. So here's some rods synapsing with bipolar cells. Bipolar cells synapse with ganglion cells, and then ganglion cells will send information about that light wave through the optic nerve back to the visual cortex. Light passes through the entire thickness of the neural layer of the retina to get to the photoreceptors. I said that earlier. And this is a photomicrograph of the retina. So these purple spots would be the nuclei of the ganglion cells. Here's the rods and cones. So we'll talk about those in more detail when we just do the retina. But there's outer segments and inner segments. And then it shows the nuclei of the bipolar cells. Here's the pigmented layer. right here of the retina. And then this is all choroid. Remember, choroid has all the blood vessels in it. I think that's it. No, one more, photograph. I think this is what your optician takes a picture of. So this is a photo of the retina. It shows an artery and vein. Here's the macula lutea. And within the macula lutea is the fovea centralis, where you have a lot of cones. And then this is the optic disc, or the blind spot, where all the axons of the ganglion cells leave the eyeball.